The funeral that changed everything. I got pregnant in 10th grade. My father didn't yell. He didn't cry. He didn't even look at me when he said it. Pack your things, you have 1 hour. My mother stood in the kitchen doorway, her hands trembling around a dish towel, her eyes wet but her mouth sealed shut. She didn't stop him. She never stopped him. That was the thing about my father, Richard Anderson. He didn't need to raise his voice to destroy you. He simply made a decision, and the world around him obeyed. I was 15 years old, 3 months pregnant, and suddenly standing on the front porch of the only home I had ever known with a single duffel bag and $43 in my pocket. He closed the door without looking back. And just like that, Jennifer Anderson ceased to exist in that house. What people don't tell you about survival is that it's ugly before it's beautiful. I stayed with my friend Maya's family for 2 weeks before I felt too ashamed to impose. I slept in a church shelter for a month. I worked double shifts at a diner called Rosie's on 4th Street, where the manager, a heavyset woman named Gloria, looked at my belly and my tired eyes and didn't ask questions. She just handed me an apron and pointed to table 7. I gave birth to my daughter, Lily, on a Tuesday morning in March at County General. No family in the waiting room. No flowers. No one holding my hand. Just me, a kind nurse named Deborah who let me squeeze her fingers until I thought I'd break them, and the sound of my daughter's first cry cutting through the cold hospital air like something holy. I named her Lily because she was the only beautiful thing I had. And I made her a promise that night, holding her in that narrow hospital bed, her tiny face scrunched and pink against my chest. Asterisk, no one will ever make you feel like you are not enough. Asterisk, the next 20 years were not a fairy tale. They were hard, grinding, slow-burning years of night classes and student loans and babysitters I could barely afford and ramen noodles for dinner, and crying in the car so Lily wouldn't hear me. But they were also years of quiet victories that no one applauded. The night I passed my paralegal certification exam, Lily drew me a card with a crayon crown on it that said, "Mommy is a queen." I taped it to the refrigerator and didn't take it down for 3 years. The morning I walked into Hargrove and Klein Law Associates as a junior associate. Not a secretary, not an assistant, but an associate, I stood outside the glass doors for a full minute and just breathed. Then I walked in. By the time Lily turned 18, I had made partner. By the time she left for Columbia University on a full academic scholarship, I was one of the most respected family law attorneys in the state. And somewhere in between all of that, I had met Daniel. Daniel Mercer was not what I expected love to look like. He wasn't a grand romantic gesture or a thunderclap moment. He was a pediatric surgeon who showed up at my firm as an expert witness in a custody case, sat across from me in the conference room with his notes perfectly organized, and then completely fumbled his coffee cup and spilled it all over my closing documents. He was mortified. I laughed for the first time in what felt like years. He asked me to dinner to apologize. I said no. He asked again 3 days later with a handwritten note left with my receptionist that said, "I promised to keep all beverages at a safe distance." Asterisk, I said yes. 3 years later, he got down on one knee in our kitchen while Lily was home for Thanksgiving, and she screamed louder than I did. We married on a Saturday in June in a garden ceremony with ivy on the walls, and Lily walking me down the aisle in a cream dress that made her look exactly like the woman I'd always hoped she'd become. My life, the one I had built from $43 and an apron at Rosie's diner, was extraordinary, and I had not spoken to my father in 20 years. The call came on a Wednesday. It was my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, the only person from that chapter of my life who had never fully let me go. She called every birthday, every Christmas, small, quiet check-ins that said, "I see you," without making a scene. "Jennifer," her voice was thick, "it's your mother." I sat down. "She passed this morning, sweetheart, in her sleep. It was peaceful." I didn't cry right away. That surprised me. I sat very still at my desk, the city humming 22 floors below me, and I felt something settle inside my chest, not grief exactly, but the closing of a door that had been left cracked open for 2 decades. She had never called me, never visited, never sent a card for Lily's birthdays, but she had existed somewhere out there as a silent, complicated fact. And now she didn't. Now the last thread connecting me to that house on Carmichael Street had been cut. I closed my office door, sat in my chair, and let myself cry for exactly 20 minutes. Then I fixed my makeup, called Daniel, and began to plan. The funeral was held on a grey Friday morning at St. Augustine's Church, the same church where I had been baptized, where I had made my first communion in white gloves and a too-stiff dress. I hadn't been inside it in 20 years. Daniel held my hand as we walked up the stone steps. He was steady the way he always was, not pushing, not pulling, just present, a fixed point. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "I'm right next to you." I nodded, gripped his hand tighter, and walked through the door. The church was small and half-filled with faces I mostly didn't recognize: neighbors, my mother's friends from her garden club, distant relatives who had aged beyond my memory. There were flowers along the aisle, white lilies. I almost laughed. Lily couldn't make it back from a medical conference in Boston in time, and I had told her not to come, that I would be all right, that I had Daniel, that I would call her the moment it was over. I slid into a pew near the back and kept my eyes on the casket. I did not look for him. I told myself I would not look for him. I felt him before I saw him, that particular heaviness in the room, the way the air around certain people carries the weight of old wounds. Richard Anderson had aged the way hard men age, not softly. His hair had gone fully white and his face had deepened into hard lines, but he still carried himself with that same rigid authority, that same carefully constructed posture that said *I am in control of every room I enter. He was sitting in the front pew. He didn't look back at me during the service. I focused on breathing, on Daniel's arm against mine, on the priest's words rising and falling in the cool, incense-heavy air. I thought about my mother, not the woman who had stayed silent on that porch, but the woman before that, the one who used to braid my hair on Sunday mornings and hum old songs under her breath, the one who smelled like lavender and kept a tin of shortbread biscuits on top of the refrigerator as though they were a secret, even though everyone knew they were there. I grieved that woman. I said goodbye to that woman. The reception after the burial was held at Aunt Carol's house, a warm and cluttered space full of too much food and too many casseroles, and the particular exhausted kindness of people who don't know what to say. I was standing near the window, a cup of tea in my hands, Daniel beside me talking quietly with Aunt Carol, when I heard the footsteps stop behind me. I knew before I turned. I turned anyway. There he was, Richard Anderson, up close and 20 years older, studying me with an expression I recognized immediately. The barely concealed assessment, the search for weakness, the old familiar architecture of his contempt wrapped in the thinnest possible layer of social grace. He looked me up and down. The tailored black dress, the pearl earrings, the composure. Something shifted in his face, not admiration, not quite, more like recalculation, and then he smiled. That slow, self-satisfied smile I had been dreaming about since I was 15 years old, standing on a porch with a duffel bag. Jennifer. He said my name like it still belonged to him. I said nothing. He tilted his head and his voice dropped just low enough to feel private, just loud enough to feel deliberate. So. You finally learned your lesson. The room didn't stop. No one else heard. It was just the two of us in that terrible, familiar moment. Him, positioned above me, waiting for shame to flicker across my face the way it always used to. I felt it start to come. That old reflex. That 15-year-old girl reaching for the duffel bag. And then something happened. She sat back down. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and I saw what I had not been able to see at 15. I saw a small man, a frightened man who had only ever known how to feel large by making others feel small. A man who had thrown away his own daughter and called it a lesson. A man who was standing at his wife's funeral and his first instinct, upon seeing the child he had discarded, was to check whether she was still broken. I felt something release in my chest, 20 years of it. Just gone. I let the silence sit between us for exactly 3 seconds, and then I smiled. Not the defensive smile, not the nervous smile, not the smile I used to offer like an apology, the real one, the one that belonged to me. "Yeah," I said calmly, warmly, almost gently. I turned slightly and my voice carried just enough. "Then meet my husband." Daniel turned from his conversation with Aunt Carol, his expression open and easy, and extended his hand. "Daniel Mercer," he said pleasantly. "You must be Jennifer's father." Richard Anderson's hand came up automatically, pure social reflex, and he shook it, but his eyes had gone somewhere else entirely. They were moving between me and Daniel and back again, and for the first time in my memory, the calculation was failing him. He had expected ruin. He had expected exactly what he had predicted that night he closed the door, a life that proved him right. A daughter who had stumbled and fallen and never fully recovered, returning to her mother's funeral humbled and diminished, carrying the evidence of his judgment like a sentence served. Instead, he was standing in front of a woman who carried herself like she owned the ground she stood on, who wore no apology on her face, who had brought with her a husband who looked at her the way Daniel looked at me, like she was the axis of a very good world. He froze, not dramatically, not in the movie way. Just he stopped, the smile fell. The recalculation spun and found nothing to land on. He said something, I don't even remember what, some hollow social syllable, and I turned back to my conversation. I did not watch him walk away. I did not need to. Later that evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch of the small hotel we'd booked for the weekend. The air was cool and smelled like rain coming. He handed me a glass of wine and sat beside me without filling the silence. That was one of my favorite things about him. He knew when silence was enough. After a while he said quietly, "You okay?" I thought about it honestly. I thought about a 15-year-old girl on a porch with $43. About Gloria at Rosie's diner handing over an apron without questions. About Deborah the nurse and a crayon crown that said "Mommy is a queen." About a garden wedding and Lily in a cream dress and 20 years of slow, grinding, unglamorous, extraordinary survival. I thought about a man who had frozen because the story he told himself had turned out to be wrong. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. I meant it more completely and more peacefully than I had ever meant anything. "I'm okay." I took a sip of wine and watched the first drops of rain begin to fall on the quiet street below. The girl he threw away had not just survived. She had built a life so full and so real and so entirely her own that his cruelty had become, in the end, the smallest footnote in a very long and beautiful story. He had wanted to be the lesson. Instead, he was barely the prologue. Asterisk and Jennifer Anderson turned the page.